Last week we heard the Ten Commandments read. And this week we hear God's people breaking the Ten Commandments. Last week we heard the commandment, "You shall have no other gods before me, and you shall not make for yourself an idol." And this week, what do God's people do? But behold, we don't know where Moses is. He's been gone a long time. Maybe let us make gods, a golden calf. Well, perhaps some of us can sympathize with God's people. We hear what we're supposed to do, and 7 short days later, we fail to keep God's law. But perhaps it's a little harder to sympathize with the way that God's people break the commandment. A golden calf. Archaeologists are always digging up little totems of wood and stone. But I imagine most of our living rooms don't have little idols in them. Idolatry, in that sense, seems like it's something of the past, safely behind us. Something out of a Monty Python sketch, along with burning witches. Idolatry does not seem, at least to me, like a live spiritual temptation. But I wonder if this lets us off the hook a little too easily. My commute from Grace takes me past the intersection of Avenue and Bloor. You probably know it well. And I notice when I cross the street that up above some of the luxury good stores are images. There are models, usually, dressed in fancy clothing, wearing expensive jewelry, and looking down on us lowly pedestrians with what I can only describe as haughty disdain. I imagine that if the people of the Bible had come to Avenue and Bloor, they would be tempted to say that that is a kind of idol. So while it's true that we don't have idols in one sense, we still have images that capture the things that we collectively value: wealth, independence, fame, and fortune. It's not for nothing that our neighbors to the south for a long time had a show called American Idol. In that most American of context, reality television. As one theologian has put it, our hearts are factories for idols. We may not make the little things that our ancestors worshipped, but still we are tempted to put something else in God's place. We're likely to worship something created rather than its creator. And the story of the Bible tells us that when something good gets put in God's place, the result is tragedy. I think a lot of this can just be learned from observing growing up. If you look around yourself or at yourself, you begin to realize as you grow up that wanting something good can still lead you to a very bad place. A love for good food or good wine over time can become an addiction. A love for success can alienate you from your family. Putting something good higher than it ought to be is a kind of slavery. Well, the monotheistic religions, Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, have always made a connection between worshiping the one God and being a little bit suspicious of images. With an image, there's a temptation to confuse the thing for what it symbolizes. I imagine some of you have been to the cathedrals of Europe. If you go to England or the Netherlands or Germany, you've probably seen where zealous reformers ripped out giant images of the Virgin or painted over murals of the Last Judgment. They were worried that what was happening wasn't worship of the one God, but idolatry. If you look around our own nave, you'll notice that we aren't quite so nervous about images as some of our Protestant forebears were. But I think this tendency to put something in God's place is something that should worry all of us. We are subject to the temptation to put our own desires in the place of God, to make God into our own image. And part of the reason I think there are so many images of God in the Bible, not all of them very comfortable, is simply so we don't confuse any one of them with the real thing. The story of God's wrath in Exodus, or the confusing parable Jesus tells in the Gospel, is meant to throw us off, to make us realize that God must be bigger and different than the gods we sometimes construct, the kind of gods that might leer down at us from their perch at Avenue and Bloor. This past week I went to an art exhibit not too far from that intersection. It was at Avenue and Hoskin, for those keeping track, and you too can go see it. It's showing for one more day on Tuesday. It was at Wycliffe College. It was a collection of Marc Chagall's prints and paintings. It's well worth seeing. If you aren't going to go, though, you can look at your service leaflet, which has on its cover a picture that Chagall drew of that golden calf episode. You may know that Chagall was a Jew, born in Russia. He left his native country, though, and was never able to return. His hometown was destroyed in a pogrom. And his adopted homeland, France, he also had to flee. In 1941, just as the Nazis began to round up Jews, he made his way to New York. He was, in other words, a man familiar with some of the idols of his time. And he used the images of his childhood faith to depict this idolatry. In one of his most famous paintings, there's on one side of the canvas the swastikas of the National Socialists, and on the other side, the hammer and sickle of the communists. Well, the piece that stuck with me when I went to see it this past week was a piece near the end of the exhibit. As you might expect from a Jewish artist, most of the artwork, which was all about the Bible, came from the Hebrew Bible, what we call the Old Testament. But a couple of pieces at the end, and one in particular, depicted something from the New Testament. And the painting that stuck with me is called Mystical Crucifixion. What's striking about this isn't only that he depicts Christ, obviously a Christian image. It's the way that he shows Christ that really struck me. Jesus is wearing, in place of his loincloth, a prayer shawl. And just to the right of the image are some other traditional symbols of Judaism. There's a candlestick and an ox for sacrifice. And I think that in his time, Chagall was making a point about idolatry. Christians in his day were tempted to forget that Jesus was a Jew. By depicting Jesus in a loincloth during the Second World War, he was reminding his viewers that Christ suffers in solidarity. Christ is the pledge of God's solidarity with all who suffer. That image was particularly poignant this past week after the terrible massacre by Hamas in the Holy Land. It was a reminder that it is still a dangerous place to be a Jew. And it was a reminder, too, that the commandment, "You shall not murder," is still relevant. Well, as the conflict grows, it seems likely that there will be more violence against civilians. And Christians in that region, Christian leaders, have called for a day of prayer and fasting on Tuesday of this week. I encourage you to take part in whatever way you can. We certainly need to remember the people of that land in our prayers, to pray for peace. The image that Chagall chose, the image of Christ crucified, is a reminder of what's at the heart of our faith. Sometimes it takes somebody outside the Christian family to remind us what we're all about. It's a reminder that Christ is the pledge of God's solidarity with all of humanity, all suffering humanity. The cross is God's response to the idols we would construct. You've probably noticed behind me there is a crucifix. And it's a reminder that the God we worship is not at all like the gods that we construct, the gods that we desire. A man suffering and helpless in solidarity with others, this is not how I would typically imagine God. And yet this is the God of the gospel. May he have mercy on us and on our world. Amen.